Today I'm going to tell you about the history and development of the Japanese sword, a weapon that's commonly associated with the samurai, from one of the oldest and rarest swords in our collection from the Kamakura period, all the way through to mass-produced swords that were used during the Second World War. I'm Joe Nickols, Project Curator of the Samurai Exhibition at the British Museum, and welcome to my corner. The British Museum has one of the largest collections of Japanese swords outside of Japan. We're going to start by looking at this blade here. This is one of the oldest and rarest blades in our collection. The iconic curved blade developed during the mid to late Heian period, so from the mid 900s onwards. And prior to that, Japanese warriors would have used straight-edged blades. There are three key parts of the blade that I want to talk about. This is the tang. It is an unpolished part of the blade. This is where the sword goes into the hilt, and it will often have an inscription naming the maker of the blade, or an inscription that is a testament to the sharpness of the blade. Next, we have the hamon, which is the visible effect of the polishing of the blade, where you can see these different crystalline formations of the nioi and the nie. And finally, at the top, when the blade starts to turn back towards a point, it's called the boshi. And at the end, the final point is called the kisaki. So, as I say, this is one of the oldest blades in our collection. And blades from the Heian period, when these curved blades started to develop, and the Kamakura period are incredibly rare. These blades would mainly have been used as a status symbol. It's important to know that early warriors in Japan were predominantly using archery as their primary weapon. These blades were carried into battle, but they were very rarely used. In fact, many of these mounted archers would have had a dagger on their body, which would have been used far more often in combat. At the end of battle, Japanese warriors would have collected heads from their fallen enemies, and that's when swords would have been used more often on the battlefield. This long, thin-bladed design was incredibly useful for when you were on a horse and you needed to draw your sword and wield it with one hand with the reins in the other. Though these swords weren't used in combat, troops on the ground had another weapon at their disposal. Though we think of swords as being the main weapon, this is actually the blade of a naginata. So you can see that it's got this incredibly long tang, and this would have been inserted into a long polearm, creating an incredibly powerful glaive weapon that could be used to defend infantry against their enemies. This blade is incredibly special. You can see this incredible design on the hamon with its hazy form. And you can see that this Naginata blade was very special, as it's got this long inscription here that speaks of who made the blade. There are many paintings of battles. Often in these paintings there are no depictions of people using swords in hand-to-hand combat. It's through these long weapons. And now on to the next object, which is a mount for a blade like this. The long sword, or the tachi, was carried in mounts like this and hung from the belt with various cords or chains. And so these loops are where the mount would attach to the belt. This style is known as the efudachi and was particularly popular amongst the imperial court. This mount is decorated with gold lacquer and has depictions of phoenixes on the scabbard here. And that would have been really appropriate for a refined setting. This metal hilt is particularly typical of the efudachi style. This is really designed to be seen at court. It is a court-style mount. The imperial court possessed a huge amount of social and political authority. And in the paintings that depict the warriors holding these types of swords, they are also in court dress, dressed in these amazing gauze robes. So they're not really looking like our quintessential image of a samurai in armor, but rather resembling these imperial courtiers. Now we're going to move on to a mount of a different design. This is another phenomenally designed mount, and it shows another part of warrior aesthetics, and that is their connection to religion. Some swords bore the images of Buddhist deities, either engraved onto the sword itself, onto the blade, or decorated onto the scabbard. In this case, we have an incredible depiction of a dragon wrapped around a straight-edged sword. This sword belongs to the deity Fudo Myo, who is known as the vanquisher of evil, and would carry a sword that would cut through any obstacle that is preventing enlightenment. And this is really interesting because it really tells us a lot about the warriors' sort of mindset and relationship to morality that they had at the time. And victory on the battlefield was associated with religion. It signified that the gods were on your side. These warriors were clearly aware of how to rationalize their role within battle. Not only would they decorate their swords with images from Buddhism, but they would also commission sutras, which are religious texts, and even, if you were incredibly wealthy, an entire temple. These types of mounts and swords that we looked at so far are from an early period of warfare that culminated in the Kamakura period, which is where the first military shogunal government establishes itself. This type of military government continued until the mid-1400s, when it collapsed and it triggered a period of intense civil war that would last until the early 1600s. And during that time, sword design and manufacture changed significantly. So we're now going to look at items related to this period of time. The intense conflict that developed from the mid-1400s to the 1600s is known as the Warring States period. And during this time, there was an increase of people who were fighting on the battlefield, particularly in hand-to-hand combat. So the swords developed into a shorter fashion that was better for wielding on the battlefield. And this is what is known as a katana. So you can see from these mounts that we no longer have the loops that were on the Tachi mounts. And this is because swords were now kept tucked into one's belt, and they would be brought out with the blade facing upwards, rather than in the Tachi, which had them facing downwards. During this time, there developed a trend to carry not just a long sword, but also a short sword called a wakizashi. When one entered a building, one would leave their long sword at the entrance, and so the shorter sword would always be on a warrior and always within arm's reach. As you can see, these have incredible designs on their mounts, with mother of pearl glinting in the lacquer of the scabbard. This is in the formation of a peacock feather. And the hilt is very different from their efudachi that I showed you earlier. Here you can see a rayskin handle that has this braiding wrapped around it. Together, this pair of swords with the katana and the wakizashi is known as a Daisho, which literally means long and short. And from the 1600s, only a person of samurai rank is allowed to carry and wear two swords. During the 1500s in particular, a lot of blades were produced, and some of these were not of high quality like these. There were low-ranking warriors called ashigaru, these are foot soldiers, and they were even instructed to slash at the extremities of their enemies. And that's because the quality of their swords was not high enough for them to even be able to cut through armor. In 1600, Tokugawa Ieyasu achieved a decisive victory to establish political control. And under the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan was in an era of peace. And this meant that swords developed into a fashionable item. And along with that came different accessories for one's sword. We're now going to take a look at some of these accessories. When swords were not being worn, they were kept on racks like this, called katana kake. This example is from the Edo period, and this would be in the home of a samurai. They were decorated in lacquer. This example has two roundels, one that features a dragon and one that features a Tachi, which is a mythological sea creature that is very auspicious and has associations with protection, not unlike the swords themselves. Another important accessory for a sword is the sword guard, also known as the tsuba. I've got 4 examples here that show different aspects of samurai taste. So this one here you might recognize because it's in the shape of Mount Fuji, and you can see here it's decorated with silver to represent that snow-capped mountain. But maybe you're a very intellectual samurai and you want a tsuba like this that actually has a world map on it. And on the reverse, you have a map of Japan with each province delicately engraved upon it. But maybe you're a samurai who prefers auspicious symbols. And here we have a tsuba decorated with iconography associated with the deity of Kangi-ten. Or maybe you're a samurai who's very interested in history. This is a very elegant designed tsuba. It is quite minimal. Here you can see the post of a bridge, and on the reverse is a fan and a stick. And these might just seem like beautiful objects, but in fact they are associated with one of Japan's most famous warriors, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, who famously had a fight with a warrior monk called Benkei in Kyoto on a bridge. What you're seeing here are extracted iconography from that fight that every samurai would be able to recognize. And so to assert their military dominance, they often reflect on times of previous warfare. As swords were simply status symbols, their mounts could be exaggerated and become quite ostentatious or playful. And this example has a serpent wrapping around the scabbard of this sword. And what's quite fun about this one is you can see that the snake is eyeing up a juicy frog that's on the utility knife that slots into the scabbard, which is called the kogai. And this motif of the snake continues onto the blade itself. And you can see here that the serpent is on the blade. And so this brings us to the end of pre-modern swords. So now I've got 2 examples of swords that came after the Tokugawa period, when Japan was under a process of westernization and leading towards the era of colonization and the Second World War. Following the collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate, the new Meiji-era government pushed a program of westernization. The sword remained an important part of the uniform, but as you can see here, it was adapted into a saber form. So you can see you've got this European style mount that has actually retained the ray skin in the hilt. And there are some beautiful details. And this scabbard detail here is ray skin as well, but polished down, so it's no longer in the rough, raw state that it's used on the hilt. And what's interesting here on the hilt is that you can see the crest of the Tokugawa. It's during this period that there is an intense romanticization of the samurai sword, fueled further by books like Bushido, The Soul of Japan. This book promoted the idea that the sword is the soul of the samurai. This blade was produced during the 20th century and is a return to the form of the traditional Japanese sword. So we've got the curved blade and we no longer have that hybrid saber handle that we had on the previous sword. Stripped of its associations of the samurai social elite, the sword became a symbol to unite the total population of Japan and mobilize it as part of its militarization program and its colonial expansion. All soldiers, including non-commissioned officers, carried a traditional curved-style blade, which was contained in this plain military mount and is known as a gunto. During the Second World War, when materials became increasingly expensive, swords like this were mass-produced. As you can see here on the hilt, this sword has been pressed, and it is not using any of the natural materials that historic swords had employed. So we have imitation ray skin. You can see this peppered texture underneath this fake braiding. So this whole thing is just an imitation of a historic sword. As I say, these swords were produced in their hundreds, and they also feature this very interesting clasp. So if you can imagine you're running around on the battlefield, this is to prevent the sword from jumping out of its case. So you have to press it down to release the blade. And as you can see here, the blade doesn't have any of those delicate and interesting details that the historic swords had. The process of manufacture through pressing is incredibly difficult, and those delicate designs are not present here. After the Pacific War, the samurai sword has become a global icon. This is due to its inclusion in countless samurai-themed media, including films, TV, and video games. This figurine here is from a franchise called Touken Ranbu, which started as a trading card game. And the popularity of Touken Ranbu has sparked a huge surge of interest in historic swords within Japan's youth, particularly young women. The characters in Touken Ranbu are handsome, anthropomorphized representations of famous Japanese swords. This figure is Mikazuki Munechika, who is the representation of one of Japan's most famous swords. The sword itself is known as Mikazuki, which means crescent moon, and is in the collection of Tokyo National Museum. The sword was originally forged in the Heian period, and at one point belonged to a 16th century shogun called Ashikaga Yoshiteru, who we know used this sword at his final battle. You can see here that the figurine is dressed in the style of the Heian period, so wearing this hitatare, which originally was a form of dress for imperial courtiers, but it became the type of garment that was worn underneath armor. So you can see some elements of armor worn on the body. In the Samurai exhibition, we're going to present a 16th century portrait of Ashikaga Yoshiteru holding a sword, as well as this figurine, which will allow you to see how swords have been represented in various media through the centuries, conveying them as a source of power and authority, but also as an emblem that has become a symbol of entertainment. We've now covered about 1,000 years of sword history and development, and I hope you found that really interesting. If you want to see these swords, most of them will be on display at the Samurai exhibition, which is open at the British Museum from the 3rd of February until the 4th of May 2026.